Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're going to be looking at a pretty specific piece of source material. It's a transcript from a Ukrainian YouTube video.
That's right. And it offers a very particular view on recent protests here in the United States.
Yeah, specifically focusing on that wave of protests against President Donald Trump right after he returned to power in January.
Exactly. The source material really zooms in on that period.
And the context that it highlights is interesting, too. It talks about protests under the slogan, "Yo."
Which means without kings.
Right, without kings. And these apparently happened across, well, dozens of cities. And it coincided with a couple of things, that military parade in D.C. and also the president's 79th birthday.
So our goal here really is to unpack this source. What are the key arguments, the insights, the perspectives it's presenting about these events?
What picture does this commentary want to paint for you, the listener, about what was happening, on the ground and the mood among the protesters it features?
It's like a specific lens, isn't it? A Ukrainian commentary looking at a moment of American political tension.
Exactly. It's about understanding that particular angle. So let's jump in.
Okay, so the source kicks things off by really emphasizing the scale of these protests. It describes them as the largest against President Trump since he came back in January, happening on one particular Saturday.
Yeah, it says these without kings actions, they supposedly span dozens of cities, thousands of people. And the source immediately frames it, saying people were protesting what they saw as the, quote, authoritarian policy of the current administration.
And, one of the core feelings it tries to capture is pretty direct. It quotes someone saying, many people are trying to say that they think the president is acting like a dictator and not like a president.
And what's interesting, or what the source finds interesting, is the turnout. It notes the numbers were, unexpected. Even the organizers were surprised.
Right. It gives that Miami example.
Yeah.
They apparently thought, maybe 2,000 people would show up?
Something like that. But the source says the reality was, much bigger. It quotes someone estimating a minimum of 5,000 people just on one sidewalk, apparently, plus more on the street.
And the conclusion this source draws from that observation is, quote, there are many people who care about this country and want to do the right thing, and obviously this government is not doing anything good for the people. That's the message it pulls out.
And it's not just crowd sizes. The source brings in specific voices, critics of the administration. It highlights Democratic figures in Congress, mentioning Senator Jamie Raskin specifically.
Yes, it quotes Raskin, supposedly speaking directly to the president, bringing up the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution.
What did it say?
According to this transcript, Raskin said those documents were written by people wanting to, quote, stop criminal bosses like you from seizing state power.
Oh, that's some pretty strong language the source chose to include there. It also uses Raskin's voice to raise concerns about how the Trump administration deals with court rulings.
Yeah, that point about judicial independence seems key in this source's narrative. It quotes Raskin basically questioning if the administration can be trusted to follow court decisions. It says they constantly maneuver. Sometimes they comply, sometimes they don't. That's the picture painted.
Which then leads into another point. The source really emphasizes this idea that popular resistance is needed to defend democracy. It quotes Raskin again, saying, we need people across America who will stand up for democracy, freedom, and the rule of law.
So the takeaway, as presented in this source, seems to be that just relying on the courts alone, it's not seen as enough from this viewpoint.
Right.
Now, moving away from the politicians for a moment, the source also includes voices from the protesters themselves. It reports on people in Atlanta expressing, deep worry about what they called radical changes in American politics.
And here's something the source makes a point of highlighting. Among those protesters, there were apparently many military veterans.
That feels like a significant inclusion, doesn't it? The source quotes one veteran who expresses shock, saying, what is happening in America now is not the real America.
It gets more pointed too, right?
It does. The quote continues, according to the source. I am horrified by the fascist takeover of the American government. I served almost 6 years in the military to fight such fascism, and I am horrified by what has happened to our government in Washington. That's a really stark parallel the source is drawing through that specific quote.
It absolutely is, connecting current events directly back to, fighting fascism in the past. The source also includes someone talking about immigrants, saying something like, This nation was built thanks to immigrants. They deserve the same respect as everyone, maybe even more.
Okay, so now the source shifts context slightly. It places all these protests against a very specific event, that military parade in Washington, D.C.
The one for the 250th anniversary of the U.S. Army.
Exactly. And this seems pretty central to the source's overall narrative.
It does. The source states that many protesters didn't see this parade as a celebration at all. They saw it as, quote, a demonstration of force reminiscent of authoritarian regimes.
And it even mentions the cost, pointing out estimates between, $25 and $45 million, covering transport, lodging, food, all that.
Yeah. And the comparison the source includes is, well, it's quite something. Let me see if I have the quote here. Yeah. I remember 2016 and all that propaganda spread about North Korea, how they put on a show for Kim Jong-un's birthday, how the West perceived it as an insult and even a threat. Well, I don't see any difference at all with what is happening now in Washington.
Wow. So the source explicitly uses that quote to draw a direct line between the two events, wanting the viewer to make that connection.
Clearly.
And this perspective, the one highlighted in the source, it frames the parade not just as an absolute waste of taxpayer money, but actually sees it as a threat to the American people. It interprets the underlying message as sort of, if you break the rules, we will destroy you, take everything you love.
Yeah, which of course ties straight back into that Maine without kings theme. The source quotes someone else saying, America is about democracy, and what we see now is not democracy. This is about one person, his ego, and his agenda. This is no longer about the land of the free and the brave. This is about one person trying to become king.
And it wasn't just D.C., right? The source makes it clear the protests were elsewhere. It mentions Philadelphia, thousands involved there, with a specific focus on cuts to humanitarian programs.
There's a quote from Philly in the source that illustrates that point. Someone saying, this administration is doing things that, for me as a person of faith, are absolutely immoral. They are cutting humanitarian aid, denying asylum, that kind of thing.
Yeah, listing specific grievances. The source also talks about protests down near Trump's Mar-a-Lago place in Florida.
What were the criticisms there, according to the source?
Well, it says participants accused the president of destroying the rule of law and ruining democratic principles. Pretty fundamental criticisms.
The source adds that those protesters near Mar-a-Lago also brought up specific actions, like alleged use of the army against civilians, the National Guard deployment, and again, that military parade in Washington, which they directly linked to his birthday.
The birthday connection again.
Yeah, and the source even throws in a detail about some rumor going around at that protest about a birthday gift being parachute dropped or something. Bit of color there.
But the core sentiment from that location, as quoted by the source, echoes everything else. But he is not a king. We did not elect a king.
Right, same message. The source also notes some cultural figures got involved, specifically mentioning the actor Mark Ruffalo.
Ah, okay. And what did it say he added?
According to the source transcript, Ruffalo spoke to demonstrators and really emphasized the historical roots of American democracy, the founding principles.
How so?
It quotes him saying something like, we don't want to be ruled by a king, a monarch, a dictator, or some lousy CEO. That's terrible. We hate that. That's why we came to America. We literally founded a new country.
So using that historical argument to reinforce the without kings message, linking it right back to the founding ideas as presented in this commentary.
Exactly. And then the source kind of wraps up its narrative by circling back, just reiterating that these without kings protests were presented as the biggest opposition demos since Trump's return. Planned across almost 2,000 actions, it says, and deliberately timed to coincide with the parade and the birthday.
And the final image the source leaves you with is that juxtaposition, right? Military hardware rolling through Washington for the Army's anniversary, while, as the source puts it, people across America were out in the streets to remind, in a democratic country, no one can be above the law.
Okay, so let's try and summarize what we've pulled out of this specific Ukrainian source in this deep dive.
Well, first, it really emphasized the scale, didn't it? The widespread nature of these without kings protests across many, many U.S. cities.
Yeah, definitely the scale. And it detailed a lot of the specific criticisms being voiced, at least by the people quoted in the source. Concerns about, perceived authoritarianism, big questions around judicial independence.
Objections to specific policies like the humanitarian aid cuts.
Right, and just general worries about the health of democratic traditions in the U.S.
And the source gave a lot of weight to how that military parade was perceived by the protesters. It featured framing it very strongly, comparing it to authoritarian displays, presenting it as a perceived threat.
Absolutely. And running through it all was that central theme, that slogan, "K without kings." A clear rejection, from this source's perspective, of a leader seen as acting like a monarch and a call for democracy and rule of law.
And it's crucial, I think, to reiterate, this is the viewpoint, these are the arguments emphasized within this specific YouTube transcript that we looked at. It's one particular lens.
Definitely. And understanding these different perspectives, even ones that are, strongly critical, like the ones presented in this source, it's really key to grasping the whole conversation, the full picture of the political discourse around events like these.
One thing this source really highlights is how symbols, like a military parade, can be interpreted in such drastically different ways.
Yeah.
In this case, the source shows it being seen by these protesters not as patriotic, but as a potential threat to the people, a threat to democratic principles.
Yeah.
Especially when, it's viewed alongside claims the leader is acting more like a king than a president.
It really makes you think, doesn't it, about how much symbols, and crucially the interpretation of those symbols, can shape public opinion and even fuel resistance movements, something to consider.